Hi, Derek. Excellent to have you on board. It's been a long time. I've tried a couple of times now to get you on one of these fireside chats. So I'm actually pleased that we've actually been able to do it for one reason or another, anyway, for
Y-
sure.
Yeah, me too, Nick. Nice to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for everyone who's listening, so Derek at the moment is Director of IT for ARC, but you've also been at Harris, if I remind me correctly, and also David Ross as well. So you've basically been to, you understand your maths for sure, and you understand the big maths and also schools market. So you've been in it for a while. Why don't you just give us a sense of, why you're in education, how long it's been, and what's important to you?
Yeah, sure. I'll try my best. I started working at Harris in 2009, so I'd not long since graduated. Um, Without wanting to, bore everybody, I actually wanted to be a surgeon. I wanted to make a difference. That was my whole thing. I think I grew up in a single parent council estate, and I was lucky that I was relatively bright. So I did reasonably well at school. I actually didn't finish school, which is one of the reasons why I'm in education. It's the simple fact that I had a terrible experience at secondary, um, really poorly run. Exam results were appalling. The leadership. I've been worked in schools now for 13, 14 years. I can tell you the leadership was really poor. And when I left university, I went into financial services, and I just didn't believe in it. I didn't believe in what I was doing, and the opportunity came to work in a school at Harris. I thought it's actually something I could probably do. It's something I probably could. It fulfills my need to try and give back. I recognise a lot of myself in the kids that they were serving. Highly disadvantaged, a lot of single parents, um, a lot of social mobility in terms of pupils moving all the time, which I did when I was younger. So I just felt it was a really good opportunity for me to do something that I felt I could make a difference. If I'm being completely honest with you, really, it's been honestly the best thing I've ever done. I think every single day, if you're not inspired by your colleagues, which I have been for many many years, and both those that are senior to me and those that are my peers, but it just the kids as well. When you go, I try and go into schools much more than probably um, than I need to in some ways. I base myself in one of our schools down in Portsmouth, because I live down that way, and it's just great to see the kids. And like I say, when you can identify a lot of yourself in these kids, it does every single day. It does spur you a little bit extra hard to put in that extra 30 minutes or that extra hour, whatever that might be.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you know what? I think it feels like a lot of people are in it for the same reasons. I don't think
Mm.
any of us are in it because we sort of think this is going to make us into millionaires and that sort of stuff. But I do think, we basically have this. I know you've been in it for a really long time, and I've been in education for a long time. But I agree. I think there's this sort of sense that you're basically making a difference. Everything you do, actually, you can almost sometimes even see the benefit of that with the children, and probably more so for you actually than probably even for me. But I think it's really, it's a market that I would never want to come out of. I think education is really, really important.
Yeah, I agree. I think my first day at Harris, I walked in this green northerner walking into a school on the outskirts of Peckham, thinking, I wonder what I'll be doing today. And I got shoved into the isolation room to look after the three naughtiest kids in the school with a laptop on my knee because there wasn't a desk. And I thought, oh, yeah, this is what it is. And I loved it. I really felt part of that community,
Mm.
that staff body, which I never felt in financial services. I was only in financial services for 3 years or 4 years or whatever it was after I graduated. Um, but I never felt that. I never felt like I was, part of a wider, um, what's the word? Like a wider belonging.
Mm.
Um, and one of the first things that a teacher said to me was, "Do you know how to work out the percentage difference between two numbers?" And I said, "I do." I said, "But why are you asking me that?" And she said, "Well, that's what we do. We look at what progress they've made." And I said, "You shouldn't be doing that." I said, "I'll do that for you. I'll build you something that would." I said, and from that day, I made it my mission. Whether I've achieved that or not is another thing. But that teachers should never ever have to do their own calculations. That they shouldn't really have to do their own analytics. That we should be presenting the information to them, so that they can. I'm not a teacher, and I'm sure we'll come on to this. I would have been the worst teacher in the world. Lockdown with my children proved that I have got no skill whatsoever for teaching. No patience, no skills. I take my hat off to every single educator out there. when my little girl asked me what a conjugated verb was, I was screaming to my wife, "Can you come and do this?" Because I just had no idea what it meant. I can do maths, but that's about it. But I think teachers should teach, and I think that leaders in schools should lead and act upon information. They shouldn't be calculating themselves, and that's been a big passion of mine since I started. And hopefully, history will look back and say that maybe I did make a difference in the early years. And certainly, the tools that we built at Harris were quite innovative for the time, probably. And at ARC now we're continuing to do that and trying to innovate the best we can to reduce ultimately it's about reducing workload on staff.
I think you should be far more confident that you've made a difference. I see you on lots of different forums, and you're in different groups as well. And I think, fundamentally, I think there's a lot of people who are listening to what basically you talk about your needs. This is what the needs of this mat are. This is the needs of the school, and absolutely, EdTech needs to be listening to that as well. So I think your authority and the things you've done, I think you should be far more confident that you definitely made a difference. I appreciate you want to continue. So it's sort of it feels that sometimes it's maybe an incomplete job, but I think you've definitely made a difference.
Well, I'm like Chandler. My mum still doesn't know what I do for a living. She tells people I'm a maths teacher because it's easier. So yeah, so I'll take your word for it because everyone else just goes, "What do you actually do?" And I was like, "No." I'm the Chandler of my family friends.
Oh man, there's far too many similarities between us then, because that's exactly like you go. I can't describe.
Yeah, exactly. As long as it pays the bills, they don't care.
So I think that nicely leads me on to one of the first questions I want to ask you, really. So again, you've been in lots of different, you've been in big mats. You basically worked in schools, and from a EdTech perspective, do you think at the moment, because I suppose sometimes I feel like we're not getting enough out of them, and I might be wrong, but do you think actually that schools and mats are getting enough out of the systems, there are EdTech systems? Do you think there are things that these EdTech systems should be thinking about and changing and maybe in their sort of direction? Because it feels like sometimes, like with blended learning came from COVID. And I appreciate it comes from a need, but there was already sometimes a need there beforehand. Like Rowena Hackwood, who I interviewed, she sort of went, "Wow, it's amazing. We can now, if a child is in the hospital because of something's happened, we can continue now to basically educate them." And you sort of go, "Oh wow, we've learned that through COVID, as a group," which I do understand. But do you think schools and mats are utilising that EdTech effectively enough?
I think it's a good question. I think my limited experience of schools outside of my sphere, obviously at Harris, we took over schools and I've worked with some local authorities as a governor, and I've seen schools that are probably not quite as high performing as the ones that I've been fortunate to work in. And I think that sometimes we use it, we as a sector, I don't say we as ARC or as Harris or anyone, but we as a sector might use EdTech to solve a problem rather than identifying the root cause. And I do think there are probably too many options out there at the moment. There are some exceptional EdTech products out there that truly make a difference. That's not just AMIS. There's ones that support curriculum, pedagogy, and everything like that, well outside of my sphere of knowledge. But I do think that there are some out there that are less effective and probably not that cost effective either. And I think for my area originally was data, and I think the data community is actually really, really strong. And I think it'd be great if we could build that wider network into more the EdTech and the data ecosystem sphere, so that we can help identify what is best practice. When you have got, we all have the same problems in schools, whether you're an educator or you're working on the operational side. We all have the same issues and the same, the same burdens and what have you. And I think that it'd be great if we could lean on each other and say, "Look, we've got this problem," and say, "Actually, you don't need EdTech for that. You need this solution, or actually this piece of software could really, really help you in this particular situation. Here's a case study on how it's changed, the way we work and our school or our mats works." I think there are huge differences between local authority and mats. Much to do with standardization. Mats have really got to grips with, if you look at data, Most of our data is standardized. The way we do our assessments is standardized. And the way that we buy our Edtech is standardized as well. We tend to have quite a rigorous approach. I can only say that from the mats that I've worked in. Obviously, I'm sure there are some mats that they don't, but quite a rigorous approach to the way that we buy Edtech. You know, they're well screened. It's well thought through. We use economies of scale where possible to get the best price for schools as well. And we try and use. I think we probably have. I certainly have tried to use our influence to help those Edtech providers get better.
Yep.
Particularly in the MIS sphere. So I don't know if that's a long-winded way of answering your question, but I think I think ultimately the first thing that we need to do is identify our actual, as a sector, what we're using, the actual ecosystem of what we're using, and actually start to understand, are some of these things even relevant anymore? I'm not going to name names, but there are a couple of 2 or 3 MIS providers out there that you don't even need to have that broader ecosystem anymore. I'm talking about communication tools, maybe assessment tracking, homework, behaviour, things like that. They're all now built into these, these fabulous new MISs that are coming onto the market. And I think if you start to rationalise that down, you can start to invest in other new technologies that actually that will solve problems and will actually add real value to you as an organisation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you basically, as things become standardized or solutions become standardized, you feel that they should all basically become consolidated. So basically you sort of go, well, we don't need to worry about that anymore because actually we know that all the any communication system effectively will do the same thing.
Yeah,
so we don't need to worry about that. So actually we combine, and you should then focus on what's next, where the big next innovations are coming from.
Well, I'm sure we'll come on to AI, but obviously that's the next big thing that that I'm sure people will be looking to invest in, but much smaller scale. I think from a MAT point of view, again, I can only talk about my experiences that I've had. When you do have a standardized approach to systems, it allows you to support the schools much better, and again, it takes that burden away from the schools. If you've got a standardized payment system and inventory systems and such like, you can take some of that burden away from them, and allow them to do what they do best. I can't imagine that any teacher goes into the profession thinking, I really want to get to grips with a parent payment system or a parent communication system. Leave that to us. Let us help the schools to use these softwares appropriately and effectively, and get the best value out of them. And hopefully that frees them up to do. Obviously, I'm not a teacher, as I've alluded to, but it's much more broader than being a teacher. The pastoral aspect of being a teacher. My wife works in a school; it's phenomenal. I said to you before, I take my hat off to every single one of them and the work that they do. And I do think there is a role for central MATs when it comes to standardisation to, like I said to you, to take that burden away from them and to make things as efficient and slick as possible.
Yeah, that's I agree. I think that's an interesting point though that you're making, which is we know lots of the systems are out there already. Let's stop sort of worrying about why we're buying into so many different sort of subsystems. And you talked about AI and data, and I think that sort of leads on quite nicely to so ultimately you've got all these systems, or potentially one now, because in the sense of they consolidated all this information. But in a MAT, you've obviously potentially, especially the size of ARC and Harris and so on, you've got a lot of schools there, and there's a lot of data. So do you find that basically that's easily pulled? Do you think that there should be an open data policy? Do you because ultimately the data is yours. In a MAT it's yours. It's not any systems. It's yours. How do you feel about the sort of open data, sort of trying to maximize what you can get from the intelligence of from that data?
I think done properly, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I think once you've got the ethics and everything in place and the right partners to work with, to achieve this, I think it's a fantastic idea. I think ultimately, it sounds cliche, but we're all in this for the same reason. The reason why I got into education was to try and make a difference to the kids' lives. Whether that's, I said to you before, whether or not that's had a huge impact or not is for debate. But I think that I can't see the point of a school down the road struggling if a school next door is doing really, really well. And that's the same for data. It's the same for analytics. I think if opening up our data and our capacity allows us to share best practice, allows us to share innovations with other schools that just simply won't have the resources or even the staffing to do this, surely that's the right thing to do for the sector. I've always been a big believer, even if it was sharing a spreadsheet or a report that we built in one. Going back in the day, if you remember CAMHS, I mean, the reports, you had to be a computer programmer to write a report that had just the kid's name in the top left corner. We used to, at Harris, we used to send them out to anybody that wanted them, because, why not? I think, like I said to you before, if you get the ethics right and you get ensure that the characteristics of the individuals are protected as best as possible, I think I can see no limit to the benefits of sharing this kind of information. I think we want to be at the forefront of, help supporting the sector where we can. And conversely, I personally really want to learn from others in the sector and see what they're doing. I think there's so many opportunities with data that we just don't tap into as a sector. I think, we are probably more reactive than we are proactive when it comes to data. I've always had this vision that when the kid, there's the person on the gate, the kids turn up late, and the person on the gate's got an iPad and it tells them there's an issue on the district line, so therefore they know that these kids are going to be late. There's no point telling them off saying, "Why are you late?" Or, it could say, Nick Finnemore comes and it looks and he goes, "Hang on a minute, he lives on the corner." I built this, me and a chap called Ed Cadwell, they built something in Power BI that told us the distance the kid lived from the school. So if Nick turned up and said, "Oh, sorry, I'm late, there was an issue with the bus," say, "No, Nick, you live around the corner." So there's so many tools. Or you could have health and police information, bulletins that come through and say, actually, there's an outbreak of this, or there's been a crime incident down this street. And it forearms people with information in order to prepare themselves and implement any kind of pastoral support that might be needed for these events. So yeah, I mean, look, listen, I'm a proper data geek, I guess. So it's hugely exciting for me. I'm sure people would have other views on sharing of information and stuff, but like I said, I can see no limit to how positive this could be.
I think and I'm just going to, it's going to take us off a little bit of a tangent, but, you sort of talked about health and everything else. And I know based on the sort of green paper and stuff about SEND and how local authorities are looking at things now, at the moment, they've got these disparate systems, and, as old as some old MISs we probably all know as well, where basically they don't really talk to each other. You've got this education system in the local authority, then you have a health care system in authority, and then you have social care, and none of them are really talking together. So you get this situation where kids are just falling through the gap. I know somebody who has, fosters children, and she also, at the same time, they both got SEND as well. So they both have, special needs. And ultimately, she feels like she's caught because of the number of people, it's like a bit of a carousel. She has her own folder, and you go, whenever would you expect in the 21st century where we are in 2023, people basically going, "Here you go, here's my folder. This basically gives you all the information on this child." How can we get it right? You just can't get it right, can you? Because you wouldn't have all the information all the time.
Yeah, I think, but I think there has been some conversations that I've certainly had with the Department for Education, obviously cover care for young people as well as schools, don't they, and adult education. And there is a real thirst for them to actually get it to improve on that.
Yeah.
And I know that they are working on some parts about what kind of data can they collect, how can they collect it effectively, how can they share it, use it. One of the examples that I gave them was, we don't, again, different schools, but we don't formally collect child in need. We don't formally, in the MIS, we don't formally collect quantifying complaints. We don't really look at turnover of staff and students in the MIS effectively. But surely those indicators, those 4 or 5 things, would actually tell you whether or not a school's on the decline before it actually is on the before it becomes a rot, so to speak. So, could the Department for Education and others, like you say, health and social care, start looking at this kind of information to predict when a child or when a family or a street or a community is in decline before it actually becomes a problem that can't be turned around? And we certainly have the systems, at Harris and at ARC, we've managed to get multiple systems to talk to each other into data warehouse. And if we can do it on what is quite a limited budget, it's not beyond the wit of man, is it, for large, local authorities to do this. And I think that because there's an appetite from the Department for Education to improve in this space, I think we probably will see some quite drastic improvements in the future.
Yeah, I hope so. Because I think, like you say, then if that information is coming down to you within the school, you again would potentially make different decisions or different interventions or whatever it might be. I think it's the same, but like you said about maths. If every math, basically the data was open. I appreciate you can't share sensitive information in the sense of all children's all their details. But if you had a situation where you had certain schools in a demographic, and then there was another map with some schools in the similar sort of type of demographic, you could easily get to the point where you go, actually, this is how we dealt with that situation in a positive way. Going back to your point of sharing good practice and sharing, that sort of positive sort of, good practice, is surely what we all want, because basically we want that child in school B to have the same experience and positivity as maybe what's happened in school A.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, when you look at Matt Lee tables and you see schools that are literally around the corner from each other and their outcomes are completely different.
Yeah.
And then you look at the demographics of the kids that they serve. And I know that there's different social contexts in every school. They're broadly the same. And I always wondered to myself, what is it, what is the magic formula that school X has got against school Y? What are they doing different? Is it the leadership? Is it the type of kids that they serve? Is it parental engagement? These are questions that I can't answer, but it's fascinating. Even where I live in West Sussex, the difference between the very best schools and the worst is huge. But in terms of locations, they're very, very close to each other.
And then some, again, it's all about support, isn't it? It's rather than looking at it from the perspective of, this is a bad school and this is a good school. It should always be. How do we get that? How do we get the levels, to be similar, no matter which, what school it is? I'm with you. That's what we all are here for, is to make sure every child has the same opportunity.
I think that's about aspirations as well, isn't it? I think coming to London is, like I say, coming from quite a disadvantaged background in the north. The aspirations for young people, the families that they have for young people in London is, in my experience, I can only talk about my own experience, it's markedly different. The aspirations of particularly, the ethnic minority communities for their children is so different from my own experiences as a child. And seeing now working in coastal schools and having worked in coastal schools in other maths, the outcomes between those types of schools and London schools are very, very different. And I don't think anyone, me included, has ever really looked into why that is such a big disparity. Is it because families have a high aspiration from different backgrounds than the typical disadvantaged white British family, or is it funding? I'm sure there are lots of social context and support you get from the local authority. I imagine is hugely important to the way that a school performs. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things that we could, as a sector, we could look into. Why is this cluster of schools doing really well? They serve the similar type of kids, or conversely, completely different types of kids. What is that magic formula that some of these maths, Harris Arc and United Learning, etc., just seem to get right all the time. And then when I look at some of the local authorities that I've lived in or worked in, and you'd have to argue they probably don't get it as right as they probably should, because ultimately, every time you see a school with negative progress 8, people decide, league tables, who cares? But those kids are the ones that ultimately suffer for it. So, again, that's something that I'm hugely conscious of in the work that I do.
Yeah. I think it's an I think, as you say, we could talk about it all day, probably, about the data and how it could help, from unconscious bias to, even supporting on things like marking and all kinds of areas, I guess. It'd be interesting to see if we can get to the point, because obviously the DfE have tried before, and normally it's to do with suppliers that slow it down or stop it because of, for competition reasons normally, or commercial reasons. And I wonder if we can ever get to that point where actually there's true open data obviously used the right way, and obviously GDPR needs to be considered, and all those things, which I appreciate are not easy to solve either. But I do feel that basically for the sake of improvement and ensuring children have equal opportunities, I think there's an element where I think data is really, really important. I've seen data where, it shows in ethnic minorities don't necessarily get their full pupil premium in certain areas, against, their sort of white counterparts and stuff. And that sort of data is really important to understand, because some of it's not done necessarily on purpose. Some of it is unconscious bias. So, you need to then go, right, how do we educate? How do we change? So, but I think, all these things are important.
Definitely.
For sure. So my other question is, so at the moment, so obviously, again, you've been in these sort of big mats, and at the moment, whenever you see how budget is distributed, and technology is normally, the thinner wedge, which I do understand, because obviously schools are heavily staffed and have to be. Do you see that changing in any way? As an example, there's a company in Japan called Softail, and they're basically looking at using their robots not as teachers, but as potentially teaching assistants, because kids, they found, actually don't mind going up to them. They don't feel that they might be criticized, or the kids sometimes look at adults and go, scary. And basically these robots aren't. Do you see technology, and I know this is a long way off, but do you see technology and robots and things like that? Do you see that sort of changing the way that schools and mats are budgeted, in the sense of how the proportion of IT will change? Because it's quite small at the moment, even though, like I say, I do understand it's a heavily staffed sort of industry.
Yeah, I think when you're just talking about IT as a service, I think, again, when you're talking about sharing of information, the cost of a service to a secondary school for Mat A, very different to Mat B and very different to Mat C. And I get it.
Okay.
I've seen this myself. I don't think it's ever been, or to my knowledge, there's ever been any way of benchmarking how much it costs, or how are you managing to do it? How are you doing that with your infrastructure to get it for that cost, or how are you doing that with your technicians and your service delivery managers, and how are you driving economies of scale for procurement? So again, it comes back to my very first, your first question about rationalizing down what we actually do spend in the first instance, and making sure that we are driving best value for money. And Adam Taylor, who's my head of IT here at ARC, he's absolutely phenomenal at the way that he tracks it. The spend, the cost of the service, the cost of the staff, the cost of the schools, comparing as best we can, comparing that to other mats and seeing how we fare, and making adjustments. Because ultimately we have to provide value for money. We, as a central service, we only exist because of the schools. And I think that's a message that I'm really keen to get out to my team, and they know it, obviously, and they live and breathe it every single day. To take your point about budgets, I've always been a big believer in that the money shouldn't be spent on Edtech. It shouldn't be spent on MISs. It should be spent in the classroom. Obviously, that might be on technology, but it ultimately needs to be spent in the classroom. And I think we are morally obligated to make sure that we drive efficiencies in as many areas as we can to make the technological advancements that we want to make as affordable as possible within the budgets that we've currently got. Because I think there is, again, I can only talk about the three mats that I've worked in, but there probably isn't a lot of slack in them, because they are already very efficient in the way that they operate. But I think as a sector, looking at the plethora of EdTech and systems that we use, I think there is a lot of fat in there that can be trimmed and can be reinvested into new technologies. My wife is a bursa stroke TA, so I think she'd be deeply offended if I said that she could ever be replaced by a robot. But I'm sure she won't mind
and don't tell her that I said that either.
No, I'm sure she won't mind when it comes to taking the kids doing Pokemon Go and stuff like that. My kids, but in terms of investment, I think the next biggest, obviously, we'll probably talk about AI in a moment, but the next biggest thing that I see on the horizon is schools choosing to do one-to-one devices with pupils. We've got a one-to-one device policy here at ARC, which is a significant investment by the organisation and by the trustees. It's phenomenal opportunity for the kids, but it's expensive. But at what point do you say that it's not worth the investment? Because I don't think we'll ever reach that point. There's always we have to prepare these young people to enter the world of work with the right educational skills, the right technological skills, the right personal skills to develop as adults. And, when was the last time you used a pen? Because I can't remember. I'm notorious for not having a pen. I mean, the only pen I use is an Apple pen. There are other pens out there, obviously, if anyone wants to tell me off. But my handwriting is so poor that it says auto detect handwriting. It's like, no, it doesn't. No, not with my handwriting, it doesn't. So, one-to-one devices, I think, is the future. I raised the point at Bet with somebody where I said that infrastructure-wise, I don't think we've got to grips with that. Not ARC again. I mean, the sector. In terms of power, how do you power if you've got 1,000 laptops in a school being used at once? How do you keep them all plugged in? The load on the network. How do you make sure that there's enough bandwidth, within the network to support all these things? When you're doing exams and you've got 150 kids in a hall, because exams are definitely going to be on laptops in the future. We know that, don't we? Like in 2 or 3 years, they're not going to be doing on paper.
Yeah.
How do you keep them all charged? We don't have plugs in the floor in classrooms typically. We definitely don't have them in sports halls where we take exams. So I think this is a very long-winded way of answering your question, but I think the investment in the future is once you've trimmed the fat from the service and from the Edtech that's probably not being used effectively in your organisation, is where are you going to invest it next? And for me, it would be in the infrastructure to support one-to-one devices and to support that next step in what you might call digital classrooms or digital learning or whatever terminology you wish to use. And then the next step would be moving into AI and trying to utilize that as best you can into practice and making the best use of what is probably the biggest thing to hit our industry since the internet.
And that leads us on to the next thing, which is about AI. Now, I am not an expert on AI, so I'm being pretty clear here. But I'm really interested in I suppose as much as where you see the positives, as much as where you see the threats as well. Because for some, when you talk to people, there's a lot of people a bit nervous as well, going, this is going to change, the way that children are learning, and how can you trust what they deliver and all those sort of things. I have a feeling that most teachers understand the ability of their children, so I'm a little bit less worried about it personally, but I might be wrong because, like I say, I'm not an AI expert. So yeah. I'm interested in your views really about AI coming into schools. Because let's face it, it's going to come into schools actually without even you implementing it or saying it's a policy. The potentially it's going to come into schools anyway. So what do you think about AI and ChatGPT and GPT and other OpenAI and and they seem to be coming on thick and fast as well. So I see there's ones about that will do oral now, in the sense of you can talk orally to them and they will give you a speech back and all that sort of thing. What's your thinking? What's your feeling about it all?
Well, it's the hot topic of the moment, isn't it? And it's only been around for about 3 months. Yeah. So I have to say I'm with you. I'm not an expert on this. I don't know a huge amount about it, and I would never want to come across as one of these overnight experts that just thinks that they know what they're talking about. The only thing I would say about ChatGPT is I did say to ChatGPT, when will West Ham win the league? And it came back and said probably never. So I've already fallen out with it as a tool. He gave me a very comprehensive response as to why West Ham will never win the league, but I disagree with it massively. He said Leicester was a fluke. Don't get your hopes up, basically. So I said, okay.
Oh, that's not good.
No, but it's probably true. Being a northerner supporting West Ham was tough as a kid, and then as an adult, when I actually had the money to go to the games, it was tough then as well. So, but I actually did reach out to somebody who is an actual expert in AI, a chap called David Foster, works for a company called ADSP.
Okay.
Highly recommend that people look into him. He's written some books that are well beyond my comprehension. But his company are somebody that I know that they've worked in government. They're looking to get into the education space, so definitely one to look out for in the future. I think that he's a really good guy. But I'm not qualified to talk about the way we teach or the way we assess. As I said to you before, lockdown proved to me that I would just be the worst teacher in the world. But even outside of education itself, I think that AI will fundamentally shift society's view on defining people as those that are well educated So at the minute, I think we see people who are well educated as those that know lots of things,
Hmm.
or those that do better in tests or in exams are people that are just good at remembering things.
Yeah.
And maybe I benefit from that. So I did when I was not so much now as I'm getting older, but when I was younger, I had a good memory. And whenever I looked at an equation in math, I just knew how to do it. And my siblings didn't, and they had to work really really hard to recall and recall those memories. But when I first heard about it, because I didn't really understand it. But when you listen to someone like David, I actually do think there will be a significant impact on education in the
Okay.
immediate term and the long term. So you look at the immediate term. I think there was an article recently about Cardiff University. Did you see that when a pupil submitted two papers? One of them got a first, the other one got a 2-1 or a 2-2, and the one that got a first was done on chat AI, done through AI, and the other one was done by a human, and they got the lesser grade. So it's obviously it's obviously there now.
Yeah.
But I do think just think about how education changed when the internet came along. I probably caught the very beginning of that when I think I left secondary school in 2000. So it would have been around then, when roughly when the internet really took off, and it changed the way that I imagine that. Cause I don't know, I don't remember when I was at school, but I imagine it changed the way that schools were then. That the fact that people could just access information and facts much much easier than they could before. Me and you probably all enough to remember the Britannica CDs and. Remember, those were the days on the Commodore and on the can't remember what computer I had. Amstrad. My auntie had an Amstrad, so
Mine was a Spectrum, just to let you know.
she was a midwife, so she was the only one in the family that had any money, so she had an Amstrad. So I used to use that for going on. I mean, you look back, if you gave a kid now a Game Boy, they probably cried their eyes out. When we saw a Game Boy, it was like, wow, this is the best thing in the world. But how did they react to the fact the internet came along? And I imagine that when someone did a piece of work, it was more about your ability to express a point of view. And I imagine that like coursework. I think coursework, did it predate me? I don't know. I remember doing coursework at secondary school, but it was about proving your wider understanding and deeper knowledge of a topic. But could AI change the way that we do coursework? I don't know. Like I say, I'm not an educator, and I don't know, but I certainly don't see this as a threat. I think initially, when I spoke to my colleague Lauren Thorpe, and I said, "Oh, are we worried about plagiarism?" And listening to people like her and listening to people like David, I think there are more benefits than there are threats. I think it might change the way that we teach and that we assess, but I think it'll definitely be for the benefits. And I'm not qualified to tell you how to integrate AI into classrooms or how to assess pupils. It's just not my area of things. But there are two things that I feel that I can add value with AI, and those two things are staff workload, and improving insights and analytics. So, in terms of insights alone, Power BI has got this really basic functionality, like ask me a question. It's not very good. It's not very good. But you imagine AI, we could start to say, look for insights and look for patterns and look for triangulation, like you were alluding to with the health and the social care, and try and predict things and patterns and emerging problems and opportunities before they come to fruition. And then you can, as I said to you before about my example of people on the gate with an iPad, being more proactive rather than being reactive. Could it improve safeguarding? I mean, what an amazing opportunity it would be if we could improve safeguarding in some ways. I know there were aspects of safeguarding that unfortunately we will never be able to completely eradicate. But if it comes to attendance and pupil entitlement and things like that, we should be harnessing these technologies to do that. I spoke to one of our vice principals, a chap called Tommy Itu, who's he loves all this kind of stuff, and he was saying that he'd done some lesson plans in Chat GPT, and he said they were unbelievably high quality. And that's just a really simple example of how teachers may potentially in the future reduce their workload. And again, it's not something that I know a lot about, planning lessons and things like that, but could you imagine if you just going in and asking it a few questions and going, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Oh, that's a great thing to ask. That's a great question to ask. I mean, the one thing that scared me a little bit, going back to my own childhood, was he said that they're looking at AI for footballers, so that they can look at an expression in a footballer's face and even the capillaries in their face to identify whether or not they're fatigued. And then I thought to myself, could you imagine that in a classroom where if you're a teacher and the kid's not paying attention or they're nodding off or whatever that might be, and it alerts them and says, I can tell from that child's facial expressions that they're not paying attention. I mean, when I was at university, my lectures, I would have been nailed every single day because I used to nod off pretty much every single lecture. There was a little fireplace in my lecture. I used to sneak into the fireplace and lean over and just have a little bit of a kip. So AI would have, could you imagine the power of that though, where if a teacher, or if it said to the teacher, I'm not using your name, but Nick doesn't understand this topic. I don't know. Is that possible? But it seems like if footballers are being judged on their endurance based on their facial expressions and their capillaries, the use of their capillaries in their face, why could we not say to a teacher, Nick don't get this, or Nick's not concentrating as hard as he should be? I mean, could you imagine the power of that?
I agree. I think you're not far from it in some ways. I don't know if you know a company called Lexplore, but they basically monitor eye movement when you're reading. So it's normally in primary school, and basically as a child reads, because children are really, really good at basically because they don't want to be perceived as not understanding how to read or being slow at reading or whatever. They're very good at basically hiding it by skimming, basically taking it home, taking longer at home, or whatever it might be. But the actual Lexplore basically monitors the eye, and basically if a child fixated on a particular word, then they find that word hard. If they scan backwards, then that they probably didn't understand the sentence the first time around, so they've gone back again. So, and again, it's not, it obviously highlights things like dyslexia and other needs, but it also highlights where a child just basically, is reading, maybe needing some support in reading. So it's so that sort of thing's already happening. So you could quite easily, as it is all this sort of, it's AI tech, I guess. But it is basically, I suppose, a little bit like that. You could easily get to a point where you can understand a chart, any chart.
Yeah.
Actually, they're a bit slower today than they were yesterday. They probably didn't get a good night's sleep.
yeah. I mean, the type of kids that we serve, and that's like someone said to me the other day, I've worked in 120 odd schools across the 3 mats that I've been in.
Yeah.
The type of kids that we serve were like me as a kid. Potentially, you don't always get a good breakfast or don't always get the right amount of sleep, and they're not always set up for the day to achieve their very best. And could we use technology to identify that? Could we use technology to identify it even before it's happening? I mean, the questions well beyond my comprehension, but it seems that to me, it's I think it's hugely. I'm optimistic about the potential that this technology can bring. I think we have to. I hate the term, but as a technology leader or whatever you want to call me, if we can get a positive message out there early to people on how to use it constructively, I think we will look back on this in years to come as being one of the most remarkable technologies to enter our sector. In the same league as the internet. To steal, what David was saying. He said originally you had the calculator and everyone was against the calculator because it was dumbed down maths. And then the internet came along. It was like, oh no, it wasn't Google, was it? When I was a kid, it was like Lycos or Find Jeeves.
Lycos, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, do you remember? Yeah, so it was search engines with a big fear because everyone was going to nick stuff on the internet and plagiarize it, and obviously what people did. And then AI's come along, and now kids won't be able to learn for themselves because they're going to steal it off. I just don't think that's the case. I think that we will adapt as a sector. I think that ultimately the kids in the schools, this is the technology that they will look back on what we see as cutting edge now as the Game Boy of the future. AI will take them to a place of, well beyond what we can perceive now. I think we've got to trust them with it as well, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be using it more in the future than we will be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a little bit like you said about the internet. The internet came, everyone's got going, oh no, that people are going to find their own facts and figures. You go, and why not? Education we all need to move forward, and understanding that 1066 is the Battle of Hastings If you're not, you can find that out anywhere. So, you don't need to now necessarily learn or have to keep hold of that information. There is other information you probably now need to keep hold of. And so it's just, I agree with you. I think it's just education having to evolve with the new technology, because at the end of the day, it is going to benefit. And, going back to your point of, the person at the gate, if they had all the different, the different data points, you could be proactive and say, look, again, it comes back to, man, my background's not that far away from yours. So, if somebody, I definitely hid anything that was happening at home. And you basically, so if somebody said, Nick, is this happening? But in the sense of, have you had breakfast? You normally have, it looks like you're always tired, blah, 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 whatever it might be. You can then get to the point you go, I'll tell you what, if you can come in a bit 10 minutes earlier, we can get you breakfast and blah, 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 or whatever it might be. But you can be proactive, I think is the key, is like I said.
I think that's just data. Even when I started 10 years ago, or 14 years ago as it is now, even with the cottage industry way of working that we had before, when everything was on spreadsheets, we were always trying to be proactive. But it was labor, it was cumbersome, it was labor, laborious, it was difficult to do. I think we're now at a point technologically where a lot of this heavy lifting can be done by machine learning and by AI, and allow us. I think we've shifted away from, going off topic a little bit, but we used to do 6 assessments a year. And every time we did an assessment, by the time that we'd finished doing the assessment and analysing it, the next one was here. So it was completely pointless. And education has adapted and gone, hang on a minute, that don't play. Let's just do less summative assessment, more high quality formative assessment. And we'll change the way we work to make data more impactful and make it so that we can spot gaps within the curriculum and within the delivery of what these pupils are learning much earlier. So I don't think we ever. If you look back 10 years ago, we never really did that. It was just, Nick's a 4B, now he's a 4A. Great, he's made progress. It was just. I don't ever remember that it being that intuitive. And I think one of the things that I talk about a little bit is about how data has been professionalized in schools over the last decade. I think we've gone from that, like I said, cottage industry where I used to make spreadsheets and they were decent. The chap called Peter Atherton used to make a phenomenal one. I don't know if you know him, but he did similar stuff to me. But they were one-man band sticky plasters over what was a much bigger problem. And I think Edtech has evolved in the last decade and taken a lot of that heavy lifting. The MISs, the 2 or 3 or 4 that are now out there that are so much better than the old ones that we've used in the past. And then, you've now got AI coming along saying, hang on a minute, guys, all that great work that you've done in the past, let me do some of that heavy lifting and actually turn data away from being laborious and cumbersome and difficult to analyze, to let me give you insights and let me give you actionable lines of inquiry for you to go into your schools and actually make a difference.
I'm totally with you 100%. I think it's really important, that I think we probably do embrace AI. One way or another, we're going to have to, because even if it is going to be a bit of a threat, we need to understand how we mitigate any of the threats that are there, but also at the same time embrace any of the positives. I suppose there's one question. So I've got a question which is this is going to be really broad, and you might hate me for this, so I apologize in advance. But if you're going to talk to any of the EdTech companies, what do you want from them? So what do you want from them for this? If you basically said, right, this is how a perfect relationship with me would be, as from a, you want to talk to the EdTech companies, what would it be?
Such a good question. Could be quite a controversial one as well.
That's all right. They're all listening, so that's good.
I think it depends on your strategy as a map, whether or not you want to go down a best of breed route. You get an MIS that does the basics very, very well, and you go out and you select the very best educational technology to support homework and assessment and all the other things that we do. Or whether you have a strategy where you go down an all-in-one solution where you accept that some parts of that software is going to be slightly inferior because it's not as heavily invested in as others, and where that trade-off point is. I think that going back to my earlier point, I've always been a big believer in that the money should be spent in the classroom on the kids directly rather than being spent on technology to a point.
Mm.
And that rationalising things down and getting the best out of what you can get is the right way forward. But in terms of messaging to technology providers, I think that the key one is something that we spoke about before we started recording is listen to the sector, is listen to what are the emerging needs of schools and of MATs and local authorities. I think local authorities get left out a lot of these conversations because MATs are run very, very differently, like I said, through standardization and through much more interoperability of systems and the way that data flows around the organization. From my experience of local authorities, that's not the case. Even the way they assess is very, very different. So it's difficult. They're comparing apples and bananas, most of the time. But I think one of the things, I can't remember who it was, I think it might have been Steve Jobs said, it was, something along the lines of, sometimes you've got to present the art of the possible to schools as well. So there's a two-way thing. It's not just about listening, because if you listen to a school, sometimes what they ask for is gone. They're already moving on to the next thing. Sometimes you've got to show them what the art of the possible is, and that could be in many, many different areas. I do think that it's really important for EdTech people to have education people working for them. I class myself as a non-teaching educationist, if that makes sense. I've never go into a teacher and say, "Oh, this is the way you should do this." I ain't got a clue. But I like to think that when they come to me and they talk to me about technology, or they talk to me about technological solutions to the problems that they have, I can give them answers, or I can tell them about the art of the possible that they haven't thought of. And it's important for me to learn about what they do as well. So having that relationship with schools where you understand the frustrations that teachers have, you understand that the needs of the pupils, and you understand the challenges that leaders face, and you try and find that sweet spot, which is very, very difficult, of listening to what they want now, but showing them what the art of the possible and what the future is really important to me, I think. Is that a very long-winded way of answering that question?
Not at all. Do you know? And I also sometimes blog about it or say about it. We Sarah does more than I do, but we sort of talk about it quite a bit. I think I agree with you. Fundamentally, one is listen. We talked about it, like you said before we started recording, because I think it's really important to understand what your needs are. Every EdTech solution is building a solution for you, not them. They might be really happy with the technology, but if it doesn't meet your needs, what's the point? I think the second part is what you were saying is, actually, if you are really good as an EdTech company, if you really are strong in understanding technology and what the future of technology is, then, then again, understand your needs, listen to your needs, but then sort of go, and do you know what? I think we could solve it in this other way that maybe not everybody else fully is aware of because of new technology that's coming in or whatever it might be. And basically ultimately becoming that symbiotic sort of relationship where it's not about a client, you're a customer, you're spending money with us. Of course, we're listening to you a little bit. No, it's got to be something which is far more invested upon. I think, that relationship is far more important actually to both of you, to the educator, to you guys as much as it is to the EdTech companies as well. And I think the more that happens, the better we're going to be in delivering for ultimately what is important is the children's outcomes.
I think it goes back to what you said before about people who work in this sector do so because they believe they can make a difference. They believe that it's wholesome, or whatever word you want to use. And the vast majority of people could probably make more money elsewhere. But you do it because you see in whatever your background, seeing those kids part of yourself, and you think, if only I had that opportunity, or if only that person knew that thing about me, it would have changed my life. I think if you're an EdTech provider and you come into this sector thinking that you're just going to make loads of cash, then just get out now, because you're not. I think if you come into this sector hoping that you can make a difference and you can make a bit of cash, then, obviously they're not charities. The organisations that I've worked for are charities, and we do so for charitable reasons. But if you're an EdTech provider and you come into this sector thinking, I'm going to make a difference to kids' lives, I'm going to make a difference to the way that teachers to reduce their workload or to reduce the burdens that they have. And out of the back of that, I'm going to make a good living. And at the end, when I retire, I'm going to look back at it and think, actually, I made a difference. I think you will be super successful in this sector. If you come into it thinking that education is a cash cow, and because you've got a technology background, you're going to solve all the world's problems without really understanding the problems that schools have. I don't think you'll be that successful. I mean, that's my view. I could be wrong. I'm sure there are people out there that have succeeded without having what I would call the right mentality. But I suspect they're few and far between.
I agree. I don't think I can't think of too many. That's for sure. So I think I agree. I think it's really important to believe in what you're doing anyway, but also man, totally agree. Derek, it's been amazing talking to you, and a big thank you for your time. I appreciate you're a very, 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 very busy person. So I know sort of taking an hour out of your diary is so something I need to thank you for sure, and say a big thank you for that. For all EdTech, all people listening, I think it's really fundamentally important to understand, as Derek was saying, think about coming and talking to your customers, and basically really understanding their pain, but also at the same time, try and build a partnership rather than just a customer supplier relationship. Get to the point where you understand all the different elements of pain. Sometimes that is going to be commercial, and sometimes that is going to be a bit of a case of how can you help save, I think. And I think that's important for everybody to understand, because fundamentally, every pound that we can give to the, putting into the children, I think is really important, as I think you've been saying, throughout this particular Fireside chat. So a big thank you, Derek. It's been amazing talking to you, and hopefully I'll see you very, very soon.
No, thanks, Nick. It's been a pleasure, and honestly, it's been a very, very enjoyable speaking to you, and speaking to someone that's got the similar kind of views to me. And hopefully, if people listening to this go away and reevaluate the way that they interact with schools and build better partnerships and more long-lasting relationships with schools, then it's been a great way. It's been a great use of both our time.
Excellent, and a big thank you for sure. Okay,
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.